Hello friends. Did you know that nearly 80% of those who watch my videos aren't subscribed? If you enjoy the content, I'd truly appreciate it if you hit that subscribe button. It helps a lot. Also, don't forget to leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments. Your interaction not only supports the channel's growth, but also helps these stories reach more people. Thank you all for being here. By the way, where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. My name is Jennifer Walsh, and I've been a park ranger at Glacier National Park in Montana for 13 years. The case I'm about to describe happened in October of 2019, and it's the reason I now carry a satellite communicator on every patrol, even for routine duties. What started as a welfare check on some overdue campers turned into the discovery of a crime scene that fundamentally changed how I think about human nature and the potential for evil that can exist in the most beautiful places on Earth. I grew up in northwestern Montana, so I've been familiar with this landscape my entire life. My father was a hunting guide who taught me to track animals and survive in backcountry conditions. My mother was a nurse who instilled in me a desire to help people. When I became a park ranger after college, I thought I understood what the job would involve: protecting visitors from natural hazards, educating people about wilderness safety, and preserving one of America's most treasured landscapes. Most of the dangers we deal with at Glacier are natural ones. Every year, we respond to accidents involving falls from cliffs, hypothermia cases, bear encounters, and hikers who get lost in areas where a wrong turn can mean the difference between life and death. I never imagined that some of the most disturbing cases I'd handle would involve crimes committed by human beings against other human beings. It started on a Friday afternoon in mid-October when I got a call from our dispatch center. A woman named Barbara Mitchell had contacted the park because her sister's family hadn't returned from their planned camping trip and weren't answering their cell phones. The family, Susan Mitchell, her husband Charles, and their two teenage children, Michael and Patricia, had been due back that morning but hadn't shown up at home or contacted anyone. They're extremely reliable people, Barbara told me when I called her back for more details. Susan always calls me the minute they get home from any trip. Something's definitely wrong. The Mitchell family had reserved a backcountry campsite at Lake McDonald for 4 nights. According to Barbara, they were experienced campers who'd been visiting Glacier for over 12 years, always staying in the same general area and following very predictable routines. She said they'd never been late returning from a camping trip, not even by a few hours. I drove out to the Lake McDonald area that afternoon and hiked the 3 miles to their reserved campsite to see if they'd simply decided to extend their stay. What I found there immediately told me this wasn't a case of campers who'd lost track of time. The campsite looked like it had been abandoned in the middle of normal activities. Their large family tent was still set up, but the rainfly was hanging loose and flapping in the wind. Personal belongings were scattered around the site in a way that suggested the family had left suddenly and unexpectedly. There were clothes hanging on a makeshift clothesline, food items left out on their camp table, and camping equipment scattered around the site as if people had just walked away in the middle of daily routines. But what really caught my attention was their vehicle, which was still parked at the trailhead where they'd left it 4 days earlier. I found Charles Mitchell's wallet in their tent, along with Susan's purse and both teenagers' cell phones. Their car keys were also in the tent, which meant that whatever had happened to them, they'd left without taking any of their essential personal items. I radioed headquarters and reported what I'd found. Within 2 hours, I was joined by my supervisor, William Garcia, and 3 other rangers. We conducted a thorough search of the area around the campsite, looking for any trace of where the family might have gone. That's when Thomas Anderson made a discovery that immediately escalated the seriousness of the situation. About a quarter-mile from the campsite, he found a piece of fabric caught on a tree branch. It was torn from a child's jacket, and there were several drops of what looked like dried blood on the material. "This doesn't look good," William said when we showed him the fabric. "We need to call in a full search and rescue operation immediately." Over the next 3 days, more than 40 searchers combed the wilderness around Lake McDonald. We had search dogs, helicopters when weather permitted, and teams of volunteers from the local mountain rescue organization. But despite covering hundreds of square miles of terrain, we found no additional trace of the Mitchell family. On the 4th day of the search, I was assigned to check some of the more remote areas that hadn't been thoroughly covered. I was working alone, following Avalanche Creek upstream from the lake, when I found something that made my blood run cold. Hidden under a pile of fallen logs about 4 miles from the Mitchell family's campsite, in an area that would be almost impossible to find unless you were specifically looking for it, was what appeared to be a makeshift grave. Someone had dug a shallow pit and covered it with rocks and debris, but recent rains had washed away some of the covering material. I could see what looked like human remains, and pieces of clothing that matched the descriptions we'd been given of what the Mitchell family was wearing when they disappeared. I immediately radioed for backup and secured the scene without disturbing anything that might be evidence. What the forensic team discovered over the following days was even worse than I'd feared. All 4 members of the Mitchell family had been murdered. Based on the evidence at the scene, it appeared they'd been killed somewhere else, and then their bodies had been transported to this remote location for burial. But the most horrifying discovery came when the investigators expanded their search of the burial area. Using ground-penetrating radar and cadaver dogs, they found evidence of additional graves in the surrounding area, some of which appeared to be much older than the Mitchell family's burial site. "We're looking at a serial killer," FBI Special Agent Robert Davis told our team during one of the briefings. "Someone who's been using this remote area to dispose of victims for what could be several years." The investigation revealed that the Mitchell family had probably been abducted from their campsite and killed elsewhere before being brought to the burial ground. The killer had made some effort to clean up the campsite and make it look like the family had simply packed up and left, but he'd made mistakes that led us to their bodies. Based on the evidence at the burial site, investigators believed the killer was someone who knew Glacier National Park extremely well. He'd chosen disposal locations that were expertly concealed and highly unlikely to be discovered by casual hikers or even experienced searchers. The case took an even more disturbing turn when forensic anthropologists began examining the older graves. They found skeletal remains representing at least 8 other individuals, indicating that this killer had been operating in the area for possibly 5 years or more. The FBI brought in additional resources and began a systematic investigation of all missing person cases in the Glacier area going back 15 years. What they discovered was a disturbing pattern of disappearances that had previously been attributed to hiking accidents or people getting lost in the wilderness. Most of the victims were families or small groups who were camping in remote backcountry areas. They'd simply vanished without a trace, leaving behind no evidence of what had happened to them. When investigators re-examined these cold cases with the knowledge that a serial killer was operating in the area, a clear pattern emerged. The breakthrough came when investigators discovered that one person had been present in the Glacier area during several of the disappearances. A local hunting and fishing guide named David Johnson, who had permits to operate in the national forest areas adjacent to the park. Johnson was a well-known figure in the local community who had been guiding hunters, fishermen, and wildlife photographers in the greater Glacier ecosystem for over 20 years. He had an excellent reputation, extensive knowledge of the wilderness, and legitimate reasons to be in remote areas where the disappearances had occurred. But when FBI agents began questioning Johnson about his whereabouts during the times of various disappearances, his alibis started to fall apart. He also had access to vehicles and equipment that would have made it possible for him to transport bodies to remote burial sites without being detected. The case against Johnson was built slowly and carefully over several months. Investigators found evidence that he'd been stalking potential victims, learning their camping routines and schedules before striking when they were most isolated and vulnerable. The investigation revealed that Johnson had created an elaborate fantasy about being the ultimate predator in the wilderness. He saw himself as a hunter of human beings, using his extensive knowledge of the backcountry and his reputation as a guide to avoid suspicion while selecting and stalking his victims. Johnson had been particularly attracted to families camping in remote areas because he enjoyed the psychological impact of destroying entire family units. He would observe families for days before attacking, learning their routines and waiting for the perfect opportunity to strike when they were isolated from any potential help. When Johnson was finally arrested at his home near the park boundary, he initially denied any involvement in the disappearances. But when confronted with physical evidence linking him to several of the crime scenes, he eventually confessed to killing the Mitchell family and 9 other groups of campers over a 7-year period. "I wanted to prove that I was the apex predator in these mountains," he told investigators during his confession. "I could track anyone, anywhere, and they'd never know I was coming until it was too late." Johnson's trial was held in federal court because the crimes had occurred on federal land. The prosecution presented evidence that he'd murdered a total of 28 people, including several children, in what they described as one of the most extensive serial killing sprees in the history of America's national parks. During the trial, we learned the horrifying details of how Johnson had carried out his crimes. He would follow families into remote camping areas, sometimes for days, studying their routines and waiting for the perfect opportunity to attack. He carried out the murders quickly and efficiently, then transported the bodies to burial sites he'd prepared in advance. Johnson was convicted on multiple counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to death. He's currently on death row at a federal prison, though his appeals are still working their way through the courts. The case had a profound impact on how Glacier National Park approaches visitor safety in backcountry areas. We now require all overnight campers to carry satellite communication devices and check in at designated times. We've also significantly increased ranger patrols in remote areas. But the psychological impact on the park staff was enormous and lasting. For years, we'd been telling families that Glacier was a safe place to experience wilderness and wildlife, while warning them about natural dangers like bears, weather, and difficult terrain. We'd never imagined that someone was systematically hunting and killing our visitors. The hardest part for me personally was thinking about all the times I'd interacted with David Johnson over the years. He'd seemed like a knowledgeable, helpful local guide who genuinely cared about the wilderness and wildlife. I'd recommended his services to visitors and had even participated in search efforts where he'd volunteered his expertise. The case also made me realize how vulnerable people become when they're camping in remote wilderness areas. The Mitchell family had done everything right according to all our safety guidelines. They'd filed proper permits, carried appropriate equipment, stayed in designated camping areas, and had extensive wilderness experience. But none of that protected them from a predator who was specifically targeting people exactly like them. I still work as a park ranger at Glacier, but I approach the job very differently now. I'm much more suspicious of people I encounter in remote areas, especially those who seem overly interested in the activities and plans of other visitors. I pay much closer attention to reports of unusual activities or people behaving strangely in backcountry areas. The case also made me an advocate for requiring satellite communicators for all backcountry camping, not just as conveniences but as critical safety measures. If the Mitchell family had been carrying emergency communication devices, they might have been able to call for help when Johnson first approached their campsite. What bothers me most about the Johnson case is realizing that he could have continued his killing spree for many more years if we hadn't found the Mitchell family's bodies when we did. He was extremely careful and methodical, and he understood how to use the vastness and isolation of wilderness areas to hide his crimes. The families of Johnson's victims have filed lawsuits against the National Park Service, claiming that we should have recognized the pattern of disappearances sooner. When you visit a national park, you trust that we're doing everything possible to keep you safe. The Johnson case taught us that we need to consider threats that we'd previously thought were impossible. The case led to significant changes in how law enforcement agencies share information about missing persons in wilderness areas. There's now a national database that specifically tracks disappearances in parks and forests, with algorithms designed to detect patterns that might indicate criminal activity rather than accidents. We've also dramatically improved our training for recognizing signs that a disappearance might be the result of foul play rather than natural causes. Rangers now know to look for specific indicators that might suggest a crime scene has been staged to look like an accident. I often think about Susan and Charles Mitchell and their children, Michael and Patricia, and what their final hours must have been like. They'd come to Glacier to spend quality time together as a family, to experience some of the most beautiful wilderness in America, and create positive memories. Susan Mitchell was a high school English teacher who loved introducing her students to literature about the American West. Charles was a civil engineer who had worked on several major infrastructure projects. Their children were honor students who were active in outdoor clubs and environmental organizations at their schools. They were good people who didn't deserve what happened to them, but their deaths weren't meaningless if they help us protect other families from similar fates. The investigation into their murders led to the capture of a serial killer who might have continued murdering innocent visitors for years. The investigation also revealed that Johnson had been escalating his crimes over time. His early victims had been solo hikers or couples, but he'd gradually moved on to targeting larger groups and families with children. If we hadn't caught him when we did, there's no telling how many more people he might have killed. I've spoken at law enforcement conferences about the lessons learned from the Johnson case. The goal is to help other rangers and police officers recognize similar patterns before they result in multiple victims. Every time I tell this story, I hope it might prevent another family from experiencing the tragedy that befell the Mitchells. I want to emphasize that cases like the Johnson murders are extremely rare. Millions of people visit Glacier and other national parks every year, and the vast majority have safe, enjoyable experiences. The statistical chances of encountering a serial killer in the wilderness remain infinitesimally small. But they're not zero, and that's something that both park visitors and law enforcement personnel need to acknowledge and prepare for. We can't let fear keep us out of the wilderness, but we need to be smart and realistic about the full range of potential dangers. If you're planning a backcountry camping trip, please take the time to file detailed itineraries with both park authorities and trusted family members. Carry satellite communication devices or personal locator beacons, especially if you're traveling in areas without cell phone coverage. Stay aware of your surroundings and trust your instincts if something doesn't feel right. And if you're a parent planning to take children into remote wilderness areas, have age-appropriate conversations with them about safety procedures and what to do if they encounter strangers in the backcountry. Most people you'll meet on trails are fellow outdoor enthusiasts who pose no threat, but children should understand the importance of staying close to family. Diane Castellanos had been protecting the wildlife at Glacier National Park in Montana for 11 years, when she discovered that some of the people she was supposed to trust with her life were the same people systematically destroying everything she'd dedicated her career to preserving. It was August 2020, during the peak of the summer visitor season, when Diane first noticed the patterns that would eventually lead her into the darkest investigation of her career. Glacier National Park was home to some of the most pristine wildlife habitat in North America. The park's 1,000,000 acres of wilderness supported populations of grizzly bears, mountain goats, bighorn sheep, wolves, and dozens of other species that had been driven to extinction or near extinction in other parts of their historic ranges. For visitors and researchers from around the world, Glacier represented one of the last places on Earth where North American wildlife could be observed in truly natural conditions. Diane's assignment was the North Fork area, a remote section of the park that bordered the Canadian wilderness and saw relatively few visitors due to its difficult access and primitive facilities. The area was critical habitat for species that required large territories and minimal human disturbance, including grizzly bears and gray wolves that ranged across the international border. The first sign that something was wrong came during Diane's regular monitoring of wildlife populations in the restricted zones around the North Fork. These areas were closed to public access to protect critical breeding habitat, but Diane conducted monthly surveys to document population numbers and animal behavior patterns. During her July survey, Diane noticed that several radio-collared grizzly bears hadn't been detected in their usual territories for over 2 weeks. The bears were part of a long-term research study tracking population dynamics and movement patterns, so their absence was immediately concerning. Grizzly bears were creatures of habit, especially during salmon runs and berry season, so disappearing from prime feeding areas was unusual behavior. Diane expanded her search to areas outside the bears' normal territories, thinking they might have moved in response to food availability or human activity. What she found instead was evidence that the bears hadn't moved at all. They had been killed. In a remote meadow 15 miles from any official trail, Diane discovered the remains of a large adult grizzly bear that had been killed and butchered with professional efficiency. The hide had been removed expertly, along with the paws, skull, and other parts that were valuable in illegal wildlife trade. The carcass had been left to scavengers, but the kill was recent enough that Diane could determine the bear had been shot with a high-powered rifle. Most disturbing was the fact that the bear's radio collar was missing. Someone had known the bear was part of a research study and had deliberately removed the tracking device to prevent the kill from being detected through normal monitoring protocols. Diane documented the scene carefully and began searching for additional evidence. Within a quarter-mile of the bear kill, she found spent rifle cartridges from expensive hunting ammunition, boot prints from high-quality hiking boots, and the remains of a temporary camp that suggested the killers had been in the area for several days. The level of preparation and equipment suggested this wasn't opportunistic poaching. Someone had planned the operation carefully, using knowledge of bear behavior and research protocols to target specific animals without detection. The clean butchering and selective removal of valuable parts indicated involvement with organized wildlife trafficking networks. Diane reported her findings to park headquarters and requested an investigation by the service's Law Enforcement Division. But the response she received was puzzling and ultimately disturbing. Instead of launching an immediate investigation, her supervisors seemed more concerned with preventing publicity than catching the people responsible. "We need to handle this carefully," her supervisor, Chief Ranger Lawrence Morrison, told her during their meeting. Poaching incidents can damage the park's reputation and affect visitor numbers. We don't want to create panic or suggest that our wildlife protection efforts are inadequate. Diane was instructed to continue her normal duties while law enforcement specialists conducted their investigation. But weeks passed without any apparent progress, and when Diane requested updates on the case, she was told that the investigation was ongoing, but that she shouldn't expect immediate results. Meanwhile, Diane's monthly wildlife surveys continued to reveal disturbing trends. More radio-collared animals were disappearing from the restricted areas. and she began finding evidence of additional kills throughout the North Fork region. Mountain goats, bighorn sheep, and wolves were being systematically hunted and butchered by people who seemed to have detailed knowledge of the park's wildlife management programs. In September, Diane made a discovery that fundamentally changed her understanding of the situation. While investigating the disappearance of a pack of gray wolves, she found a temporary hunting camp that had been recently abandoned. The camp was sophisticated, with military-grade equipment, expensive hunting gear, and communication devices that suggested coordination with outside parties. Among the equipment left behind, Diane found a GPS unit that contained waypoints marking the locations of radio-collared animals throughout the park. The waypoints were updated with current date and timestamps, indicating that someone was providing real-time tracking information to the hunters. Diane realized that the poaching operation wasn't just using publicly available information about wildlife locations. Someone with access to the park's research databases was feeding information directly to the hunters, allowing them to locate and target specific animals with precision. The GPS unit also contained waypoints for locations outside Glacier National Park, including coordinates for areas in Yellowstone, Grand Teton, and other major national parks across the western United States. The scope of the operation was much larger than Diane had imagined. This was a coordinated network that was operating in multiple protected areas. Diane downloaded the data from the GPS unit before reporting her discovery to park headquarters. She wanted to analyze the information herself before turning it over to investigators who had shown limited interest in pursuing the case aggressively. What Diane found in the GPS data was evidence of a systematic campaign to harvest trophy animals from America's national parks. The waypoints marked not just the locations of research animals, but also the sites where they had been killed and processed. The data showed that dozens of animals had been taken over the previous 2 years, all from restricted areas where hunting was absolutely prohibited. More disturbing was the discovery that some of the waypoints corresponded with official Park Service activities. Several kills had occurred during periods when park personnel were supposedly conducting research or maintenance activities in the same areas. The timing suggested that park employees were either directly involved in the poaching or providing cover for the operations. Diane realized she needed outside help to properly investigate what she was discovering. The scope of the operation and the possible involvement of Park Service personnel meant that normal internal channels might be compromised. Diane contacted Special Agent Carol Hendricks of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, who specialized in investigating wildlife trafficking networks. Agent Hendricks had experience with cases involving organized poaching operations and the connections between illegal hunting and international wildlife trade. When Diane shared her findings with Agent Hendricks, the federal investigator immediately recognized the patterns as indicators of a high-end trophy hunting operation. What you're describing sounds like a service that caters to extremely wealthy clients who want access to animals they can't legally hunt, Agent Hendricks explained. These operations charge enormous fees, sometimes hundreds of thousands of dollars, for the opportunity to hunt protected species in restricted areas. The clients get the thrill of taking truly rare trophies, while the operators make more money from a single kill than most poachers see in years of illegal activity. Agent Hendricks explained that such operations required extensive inside knowledge of park operations, animal behavior, and law enforcement protocols. They need people on the inside, she said, someone who can provide real-time information about animal locations, research activities, and ranger patrol schedules. Diane provided Agent Hendricks with copies of all the evidence she had collected, including the GPS data and photographs of the kill sites. Agent Hendricks initiated a federal investigation, but she warned Diane that the process would be complex and potentially dangerous. If Park Service personnel are involved, your safety could be at risk, Agent Hendricks warned. These operations protect themselves by eliminating threats, and that includes law enforcement officers who get too close to their activities. Agent Hendricks advised Diane to continue her normal duties while maintaining careful documentation of anything suspicious she observed. But Diane was also instructed to avoid conducting solo investigations or putting herself in situations where she might encounter the poaching operation directly. Despite these warnings, Diane felt compelled to continue investigating. The systematic destruction of wildlife in the park she had dedicated her career to protecting was something she couldn't ignore, even if pursuing the case put her at personal risk. Over the following weeks, Diane began paying closer attention to the activities of her colleagues and supervisors. If someone within the Park Service was providing information to poachers, she needed to identify who was involved and how they were accessing the data. What Diane discovered was a pattern of suspicious behavior that suggested the conspiracy reached higher levels of park management than she had imagined. Several supervisors had access to the research databases that contained animal tracking information, and their work schedules often correlated with periods when poaching activities occurred. Most suspiciously, Chief Ranger Lawrence Morrison had been discouraging aggressive investigation of the poaching incidents, while simultaneously having unusual knowledge of when and where new kills were being discovered. Morrison seemed to know about evidence before it was officially reported, and he consistently steered investigations away from areas where more evidence might be found. Diane began conducting her own surveillance of park personnel, documenting their activities and looking for connections to outside parties who might be involved in the poaching operation. What she found was evidence of a conspiracy that included not just park employees, but also local outfitters, wealthy hunters from across the country, and international wildlife traffickers. The operation worked by using Park Service employees to provide real-time information about animal locations and ranger activities. Wealthy clients would pay enormous fees for guided hunts in restricted areas, with the understanding that they were purchasing access to truly rare and protected species. The hunts were conducted during periods when normal park activities provided cover for the presence of armed personnel in restricted areas. Research activities, maintenance operations, and training exercises were used to justify the presence of people and vehicles in areas where poaching was occurring. Diane realized that Chief Ranger Morrison was not just aware of the poaching, he was coordinating it. His position gave him access to all research data, patrol schedules, and law enforcement activities. He could ensure that poaching operations occurred when they wouldn't be detected, and that any investigations would be ineffective or misdirected. But Morrison wasn't operating alone. The conspiracy included other park employees, local business owners, and what appeared to be organized crime figures who specialized in wildlife trafficking. The operation was sophisticated enough to move trophy materials internationally, serving clients who collected rare specimens from protected areas around the world. Diane documented her findings and prepared to share them with Agent Hendricks, but before she could make contact, she received a warning that changed everything. An anonymous note left in her ranger station warned her that her investigation had been detected and that her life was in danger. "You need to stop digging or you'll end up like the animals you're trying to protect," the note read. "Some hunts are more dangerous than others, and you're about to become the prey." Diane realized that the people involved in the poaching operation were aware of her investigation and were prepared to use violence to protect their activities. But instead of backing down, she decided to accelerate her efforts to expose the conspiracy. Working quickly, Diane compiled all her evidence and transmitted it to Agent Hendricks through encrypted channels that couldn't be monitored by Park Service personnel. She also created copies of all documentation and stored them in secure locations outside the park, ensuring that the evidence would survive even if something happened to her. Agent Hendricks responded immediately, informing Diane that federal law enforcement agencies were preparing to conduct coordinated raids on the poaching network. But the operation would take time to organize, and, in the meantime, Diane needed to maintain her normal activities while avoiding anything that might alert the conspirators. But the poachers had no intention of waiting for Diane to complete her investigation. 2 days after receiving the anonymous warning, Diane was conducting a routine patrol in the North Fork area when she was approached by 3 armed men who claimed to be conducting authorized research activities. The men, dressed in official-looking outdoor gear and carrying credentials that appeared legitimate, told Diane they were tracking a radio-collared grizzly bear for a university research project. They asked her to assist with their work by helping locate the bear and ensuring that no other park personnel interfered with their activities. Diane immediately recognized this as an attempt to use her to facilitate a poaching operation. The men were trying to get her to help them locate and kill a protected animal while providing them with cover from law enforcement detection. Diane pretended to cooperate while actually documenting the men's identities and activities. She provided false information about animal locations while secretly photographing the men and their equipment. She also activated a personal emergency beacon that would alert law enforcement to her location and situation. The situation escalated when one of the men realized that Diane wasn't actually helping them locate the bear. "You're not being very cooperative," he told her, while moving his hand toward the rifle he was carrying. "Maybe you need some encouragement to take this more seriously." Diane realized she was in immediate danger. The men weren't just poachers. They were enforcers who were prepared to use violence to protect the operation. She was alone in a remote area with no immediate backup, and the men clearly had no intention of allowing her to report their activities. Diane ran. Using her knowledge of the terrain and her superior physical conditioning, she evaded the armed men and made it to an area where her radio could reach park headquarters. But when she called for assistance, she discovered that Chief Ranger Morrison was coordinating the response to her emergency call. Morrison directed responding rangers away from Diane's actual location, claiming she had reported her position incorrectly. Meanwhile, the armed men who had threatened her were given accurate information about her location and movements, allowing them to continue pursuing her. Diane realized that Morrison was actively working to prevent her rescue, while enabling her attackers to locate and eliminate her. She was trapped in a situation where the normal emergency response systems had been compromised by the same conspiracy she was investigating. Using her emergency beacon, Diane was able to contact Agent Hendricks directly and request federal assistance. Agent Hendricks coordinated with FBI personnel to locate and rescue Diane, bypassing the compromised Park Service Response System. Federal agents reached Diane before her attackers could locate her, but the armed men escaped into the wilderness before they could be apprehended. The rescue operation revealed the extent to which Park Service personnel had been compromised by the poaching conspiracy. Agent Hendricks used Diane's evidence to coordinate raids on the poaching network that resulted in arrests across multiple states. The investigation revealed that the operation had been active for over 5 years, generating millions of dollars in profits from illegal trophy hunting in national parks. Chief Ranger Morrison and several other Park Service employees were arrested on federal charges related to wildlife trafficking and conspiracy. The investigation also uncovered connections to organized crime figures and international wildlife smuggling networks that had been using American national parks as sources for rare specimens. But many aspects of the conspiracy were never fully exposed. Some of the wealthy clients who had paid for illegal hunts were never identified, and much of the money generated by the operation was never recovered. The international connection suggested that the American operation was part of a global network that probably continues to operate in other locations. The prosecution of the poaching network revealed details that shocked even experienced federal investigators. The operation had generated over $12 million in profits over 5 years, serving clients who paid between $200,000 and $800,000 for the opportunity to hunt protected species in restricted areas of national parks. The client list, when finally obtained through federal subpoenas, read like a directory of American wealth and political influence. Corporate executives, entertainment industry figures, foreign nationals, and even some elected officials had paid enormous sums for the thrill of hunting animals that existed nowhere else on Earth in their natural habitat. The operation was far more sophisticated than typical poaching rings. Clients were flown in on private aircraft to remote airstrips, transported to luxury hunting camps established in restricted areas, and provided with professional guides who had intimate knowledge of animal behavior and park operations. The hunts were conducted with military precision, using advanced equipment and communication systems to avoid detection. Agent Hendricks discovered that the poaching network had connections to similar operations in Africa, Asia, and South America, creating a global marketplace for wealthy individuals who viewed protected species as ultimate hunting challenges. The American operation was considered especially prestigious because it provided access to animals in areas that were supposed to be completely protected from human exploitation. The level of corruption within the National Park Service was more extensive than initially suspected. Morrison had recruited park employees at multiple levels, from maintenance workers who provided information about remote access routes to research scientists who shared real-time animal tracking data. The conspiracy included people who had worked for the Park Service for decades, building trusted relationships that made their betrayal particularly devastating. Dr. Arthur Brennan, the park's chief wildlife biologist, had been providing detailed information about animal behavior patterns, breeding cycles, and territory boundaries that allowed hunters to target the most valuable specimens. His research data was used to identify animals with the largest antlers, the most impressive physical characteristics, or the rarest genetic traits. Maintenance supervisor Beverly Patterson had been creating access routes for hunting vehicles by scheduling road maintenance activities that provided cover for transporting clients and equipment into restricted areas. Her knowledge of park infrastructure allowed the hunting operation to move people and materials without using official checkpoints or monitored access points. Even some seasonal employees had been recruited to serve as lookouts and communication relays, providing early warning when legitimate park personnel approached areas where hunting activities were taking place. The conspiracy had created a parallel command structure within the park that could coordinate illegal activities while maintaining the appearance of normal park operations. The investigation revealed that the poaching network had killed or captured over 200 protected animals over 5 years, including several species that were already endangered. The ecological impact was devastating, disrupting breeding populations and research programs that had been monitoring wildlife recovery for decades. Some of the animals killed were famous individuals that had been featured in documentaries and educational programs. A grizzly bear known as Old Blue, who had been followed by researchers for over 15 years, was found to have been killed for a client who wanted to add a celebrity bear to his trophy collection. The bear's radio collar and research records allowed the hunters to locate and kill an animal that had become a symbol of successful wildlife conservation. The loss of breeding animals was particularly damaging to species recovery efforts. Several female bears and wolves that had been documented as successful mothers were killed during critical periods when they were caring for young offspring. The deaths not only removed breeding individuals from the population, but also resulted in the loss of their offspring, compounding the ecological damage. The poaching network had also been selling live animals to private collectors and illegal wildlife dealers. Some rare species were captured rather than killed, transported to private facilities where they were held in captivity for wealthy individuals who wanted to own truly unique animals. The capture operations were particularly cruel, often involving the killing of mother animals to obtain their offspring. Agent Hendricks discovered evidence that some captured animals had been sold to overseas buyers who operated private hunting reserves where wealthy clients could hunt protected species in controlled environments. The American wildlife was being exported to facilities in countries with weak wildlife protection laws, where the animals would eventually be killed by hunters who wanted guaranteed access to rare North American species. The financial scope of the operation was staggering. Individual hunts generated between $200,000 and $800,000, depending on the species and the difficulty of the hunt. A grizzly bear hunt in a restricted area of Glacier National Park cost $400,000, while a wolf pack hunt that allowed clients to kill multiple animals cost $600,000. The most expensive hunts involved species that were on the endangered species list, with some clients paying over $1 million for the opportunity to kill animals that were critically endangered. The money was distributed through a complex network of shell companies and offshore accounts that made it difficult for investigators to trace the financial flows. Morrison and other Park Service employees received monthly payments disguised as consulting fees or equipment purchases, while the primary organizers of the network kept the majority of the profits. The investigation also revealed that the poaching network had been using its profits to corrupt law enforcement officials and government regulators who might interfere with their operations. Bribes were paid to officials in multiple agencies to ensure that investigations would be ineffective or misdirected. Some officials were given free hunting trips or other benefits in exchange for their cooperation. The trial of the conspiracy members was complicated by the involvement of wealthy and politically connected individuals who had extensive legal resources. Several clients hired teams of expensive lawyers who argued that they had been deceived about the legality of the hunts, claiming they had been told the activities were authorized research or wildlife management operations. Some clients reached plea agreements that allowed them to avoid prison time in exchange for paying enormous fines and cooperating with ongoing investigations. But others fought the charges aggressively, using their wealth and connections to challenge evidence and delay proceedings. Morrison was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison after being convicted on multiple charges, including conspiracy, wildlife trafficking, and racketeering. Other Park Service employees received sentences ranging from 3 to 10 years, depending on their level of involvement and cooperation with investigators. But the sentences were considered inadequate by many wildlife protection advocates who argued that the ecological damage caused by the poaching network would take decades to repair. The loss of breeding animals from already vulnerable populations had set back conservation efforts that had required years of careful management and scientific research. The corruption scandal devastated the national park, service's reputation, and led to extensive reforms in personnel screening and oversight procedures. New protocols were implemented to prevent unauthorized access to research data and animal tracking information. Background checks for park employees were expanded to include financial investigations that might identify people vulnerable to corruption. But the reforms came too late to prevent the damage that had already been done. The poaching network had operated for 5 years with virtual impunity, killing or capturing hundreds of protected animals while generating millions of dollars in profits. The conspiracy had turned America's most treasured wilderness areas into private hunting preserves for wealthy criminals. Diane's investigation had exposed one major poaching network, but it had also revealed how vulnerable America's protected wildlife was to organized criminal exploitation. The conspiracy had operated for years without detection, because it involved people who were supposed to be protecting the animals they were actually helping to destroy. The arrests and prosecutions that resulted from Diane's investigation were successful, but they came at enormous personal cost. Diane received death threats from unknown sources and was forced to relocate to a different state for her safety. Her career with the National Park Service was effectively ended by the investigation, as she could no longer trust the colleagues and supervisors she had worked with for years. The threats against Diane continued even after the prosecutions were completed. Anonymous messages warned her that the poaching network had connections to other criminal organizations that might seek revenge for her role in exposing the conspiracy. Federal marshals provided security for Diane during the trials, but long-term protection was impossible to maintain. Diane now works for a private wildlife conservation organization, but she continues to monitor illegal activities in national parks. Her experience taught her that wildlife protection requires vigilance, not just against external threats, but against corruption within the agencies and organizations tasked with conservation responsibilities. The conservation organization Diane works for has documented similar patterns of wildlife trafficking in national parks across the country. The methods used by the Glacier National Park Network have been replicated in other locations, suggesting that organized wildlife crime is a growing threat to America's protected species. Reports from other parks describe the same patterns Diane had observed: the systematic disappearance of research animals, the involvement of park personnel in illegal activities, and the sophisticated operations that cater to wealthy clients who want access to protected species. The problem appears to be national in scope, involving multiple criminal networks that operate with similar methods and objectives. Agent Hendricks has continued investigating wildlife trafficking networks and has found evidence of connections between the Glacier operation and similar conspiracies in other countries. The global demand for rare wildlife trophies has created international criminal networks that share information, resources, and clients across national boundaries. The wealthy individuals who pay for illegal hunting experiences represent a market that spans multiple continents and includes people with enormous financial resources and political connections. These clients view protected species as ultimate status symbols, and their willingness to pay extraordinary prices for illegal hunting experiences ensures that criminal networks will continue to exploit vulnerable wildlife populations. The enforcement challenges are enormous. National parks cover millions of acres of remote wilderness where illegal activities can be conducted far from any oversight. The same characteristics that make these areas valuable for wildlife protection also make them ideal for criminal exploitation. The involvement of Park Service personnel in wildlife trafficking creates additional enforcement complications. When the people responsible for protecting wildlife are actually facilitating its destruction, normal oversight and accountability measures become ineffective. The corruption can spread throughout park organizations, creating networks of complicit employees who protect each other while exploiting the resources they are supposed to preserve. The international connections of wildlife trafficking networks create jurisdictional complications that make prosecution difficult. Evidence may be located in multiple countries, clients may be foreign nationals with diplomatic immunity, and profits may be hidden in financial systems that are beyond the reach of American law enforcement. The ecological consequences of organized wildlife trafficking extend far beyond the immediate loss of individual animals. The disruption of breeding populations and social structures can have cascading effects throughout ecosystems, affecting species recovery efforts and the balance of predator-prey relationships. The psychological impact on research scientists and wildlife biologists has been profound. Many researchers have dedicated their careers to studying and protecting specific animals, forming emotional connections to individual bears, wolves, and other species that they have monitored for years. Discovering that their research data has been used to facilitate the killing of these animals has been devastating for many scientists. Some researchers have left their careers entirely, unable to continue work that might inadvertently contribute to wildlife exploitation. Others have developed elaborate security measures to protect their data, but these precautions interfere with legitimate research collaboration and data sharing that are essential for effective wildlife management. The tourism industry in areas affected by wildlife trafficking has also suffered significant impacts. Many visitors come to national parks specifically to observe rare wildlife in natural settings. When animal populations are depleted by illegal hunting, the visitor experience is diminished and park revenues decline. Local communities that depend on wildlife-related tourism have been particularly affected. Guide services, hotels, restaurants, and other businesses that cater to wildlife enthusiasts have seen reduced demand as animal populations have declined, and visitors have become aware of the threats facing protected species. The psychological impact on legitimate park employees has been severe. Many rangers and other park personnel feel betrayed by colleagues who were secretly involved in wildlife trafficking while pretending to share conservation values. The atmosphere of suspicion and mistrust that followed the exposure of the conspiracy has made normal park operations more difficult. Employee morale has been affected by the knowledge that anyone could potentially be involved in illegal activities. The comprehensive background checks and oversight measures implemented after the scandal have created an atmosphere where employees feel constantly monitored and suspected of potential wrongdoing. The legal precedents established by the Glacier prosecutions have been important for future wildlife protection efforts. The sentences imposed on the conspirators demonstrated that wildlife trafficking would be prosecuted aggressively, even when it involved government employees and wealthy clients with extensive legal resources. But the legal victories have not eliminated the underlying demand for illegal wildlife experiences. The wealthy individuals who create the market for these services continue to exist, and new criminal networks are likely to emerge to serve their demands. The enormous profits available from wildlife trafficking ensure that criminal organizations will continue attempting to exploit protected species. The reforms implemented by the National Park Service have improved security and oversight, but they cannot eliminate all vulnerabilities. The vast scale of America's national park system and the remote nature of many protected areas means that some level of criminal exploitation is probably inevitable. The challenge for wildlife protection agencies is to develop enforcement strategies that can detect and disrupt criminal networks before they can cause irreversible ecological damage. This requires not just better security measures but also international cooperation to address the global demand for illegal wildlife products. Diane continues to receive reports from current and former Park Service employees who suspect similar activities in other locations. The patterns she documented at Glacier National Park have been observed in other parks, suggesting that wildlife trafficking networks continue to operate despite increased law enforcement attention. The reports describe the same warning signs that Diane had learned to recognize: the disappearance of research animals, suspicious activities by park personnel, and evidence of organized hunting operations in restricted areas. But many potential witnesses are reluctant to come forward, afraid of the personal consequences of challenging powerful criminal organizations. The demand for rare trophy animals remains strong among wealthy collectors who view protected species as the ultimate hunting challenges. As long as there are people willing to pay enormous sums for illegal access to protected wildlife, there will be criminal networks ready to provide those services. The technological capabilities available to modern wildlife traffickers have made their operations more sophisticated and harder to detect. Advanced communication systems, GPS tracking, and other technologies that were originally developed for legitimate wildlife research can be adapted for illegal hunting operations. The globalization of wildlife trafficking has created criminal networks that operate across multiple countries and jurisdictions. making law enforcement coordination more complex and difficult. The same factors that facilitate legitimate international trade and communication also benefit criminal organizations that exploit protected species. Diane's investigation proved that America's national parks are not immune to organized criminal exploitation. The vast wilderness areas that protect the country's most precious wildlife resources also provide perfect cover for illegal activities conducted by people who understand how to avoid detection and eliminate threats to their operations. The wildlife that Diane dedicated her career to protecting continues to face threats from poaching networks that operate with sophisticated methods and extensive resources. Some of those threats come from people who are supposed to be protecting the animals they are actually helping to destroy. The corruption that enabled the Glacier National Park trafficking network was not unique to that location or those individuals. The same vulnerabilities exist throughout America's protected areas, and similar conspiracies are probably operating in other locations where wealthy criminals can buy access to rare and protected species. The mountains and forests of Glacier National Park are quiet again, but Diane knows that the silence doesn't necessarily mean the threats have ended. The criminal networks that exploit protected wildlife are adaptable and persistent, finding new ways to operate even after major enforcement actions. The ongoing threat to America's protected wildlife requires constant vigilance from law enforcement agencies, park personnel, and the general public. The enormous profits available from wildlife trafficking ensure that criminal organizations will continue attempting to exploit vulnerable species, regardless of the legal consequences. But the most disturbing lesson from Diane's investigation is that the greatest threats to protected wildlife may come from within the organizations tasked with conservation responsibilities. When the protectors become the predators, America's most precious natural heritage becomes nothing more than a commodity to be sold to the highest bidder. Somewhere in America's protected wilderness, criminal networks continue to hunt the rarest and most precious wildlife, serving clients who view protected species as trophies to be claimed regardless of law or conservation necessity. And some of those facilitating the hunting are the same people paid to protect what they are actually helping to destroy, turning America's greatest conservation success stories into private hunting preserves for those wealthy enough to buy access to anything they desire. The war between conservation and exploitation continues in the deep places of America's wilderness, where vast sums of money can buy access to experiences that should belong to future generations. In that war, the animals have no voice except for people like Diane who risk everything to speak for them. But as Diane learned, sometimes the greatest enemies of wildlife protection are found among those who claim to be its greatest defenders. Melvin had been manning Fire Tower 19 in the North Cascades for 6 seasons, long enough to understand that isolation does things to a person's mind that can't be undone. Perched 90 feet above the forest floor on a steel frame that groaned and swayed in the mountain winds, the tower offered a commanding view of nearly 400 square miles of wilderness, but it also provided the kind of complete solitude that either strengthened a man or slowly drove him insane. The assignment was supposed to last 4 months, from June through September, monitoring weather conditions and watching for the telltale wisps of smoke that could quickly become catastrophic wildfires. But this season had been different from the start, marked by equipment failures, communication problems, and a growing sense that something fundamental was wrong with the entire operation. Agnes, his radio dispatcher at the Regional Coordination Center, had been his primary human contact for the past 8 weeks. Her voice crackled through the static every morning at 800 sharp for weather reports and fire danger assessments, then again at 1700 for end-of-shift updates and supply requests. The routine had become as essential to Melvin's mental health as food and water, a daily reminder that he was still connected to the world beyond his isolated tower. But lately, even those conversations had become strained. Agnes seemed distracted, often asking him to repeat information he'd just provided, sometimes forgetting details about supply deliveries or maintenance schedules they'd discussed the previous day. When Melvin had mentioned his concerns about her apparent confusion, she'd laughed it off, blaming budget cuts and increased workload for her scattered attention. The tower itself sat in a section of national forest that received very little human traffic. No established hiking trails led to the structure, and the access road had been washed out during spring flooding 3 years earlier, making the location accessible only by helicopter or a grueling 2-day hike through difficult terrain. This isolation was exactly what made Tower 19 valuable for fire spotting, but it also meant that Melvin could go weeks without seeing another human being. The job attracted a specific type of person, usually older men who were comfortable with solitude and had the mental discipline to maintain focus during long periods of inactivity. Melvin fit the profile perfectly. At 64, he was a retired insurance investigator who had grown tired of dealing with fraud cases and lying claimants. The fire watch position offered him meaningful work that required his analytical skills while providing the kind of peaceful environment he'd been craving for years. But this season had tested even his considerable tolerance for isolation. Equipment failures had become increasingly frequent and inexplicable. The weather monitoring instruments provided readings that didn't match conditions he could observe directly. Radio equipment experienced interference that made communication difficult even during clear weather. Most troubling, the tower's structural integrity had begun showing signs of stress that shouldn't have developed for decades. The problems had started in July, just subtle anomalies that Melvin initially attributed to normal wear and equipment aging. The barometric pressure readings were consistently off by small amounts. The wind speed measurements fluctuated erratically, and the radio occasionally picked up transmissions that seemed to originate from locations where no broadcasting equipment existed. By August, the irregularities had become impossible to ignore. Melvin would observe clear skies and calm conditions while his instruments recorded severe weather warnings. Radio communications with Agnes became increasingly garbled, with conversations interrupted by bursts of static that sometimes resembled voices speaking in languages he couldn't identify. Most disturbing were the structural problems with the tower itself. Bolts that had been properly tightened during routine maintenance were found loose within days. Support cables showed signs of stress and fraying, despite being rated for conditions far more severe than anything they'd experienced. The observation deck developed a subtle but persistent vibration that seemed to worsen during nighttime hours. Melvin had requested a maintenance inspection, but the scheduling conflicts and budget constraints that plagued the Forest Service meant that no technicians would be available until the end of fire season. He'd been told to document any problems and continue operations unless conditions became immediately dangerous. It was during the 3rd week of August that Melvin first noticed the signs of unauthorized human activity in the forest below his tower. Movement patterns that were too organized to be wildlife, too consistent to be random. Through his high-powered binoculars, he could observe figures moving between the trees with apparent purpose, following routes that suggested familiarity with the terrain. The figures appeared to be maintaining surveillance of his tower, positioning themselves at locations that provided clear sight lines while remaining concealed from casual observation. They moved primarily during early morning and evening hours, when lighting conditions made detailed identification difficult, but their behavior suggested coordinated activity rather than coincidental hiking. Melvin had attempted to report these observations to Agnes, but communication problems had made detailed discussions impossible. Static interference seemed to intensify whenever he tried to describe specific details about the unauthorized personnel. making it difficult to convey the scope or significance of what he was observing. "Agnes, this is Tower 19. He'd radioed during one particularly frustrating attempt. "I've got consistent signs of unauthorized activity in Sector 7. Multiple individuals, organized movement patterns, possible surveillance operations." The response had been nearly unintelligible through the static. "Copy. Tower. Weather conditions. Supply drop. Thursday." "Negative, Agnes. This isn't about weather or supplies," Melvin had replied. "I need to report possible security concerns, maybe law enforcement activity or—" But the transmission had cut off entirely, leaving him with dead silence that lasted for the rest of that day. When communications resumed the following morning, Agnes had acted as if no previous conversation had occurred, asking for routine weather data without mentioning his security concerns. The pattern of communication failures had become increasingly suspicious. Melvin could discuss mundane operational matters without difficulty, but any attempt to report unusual observations or request assistance with security concerns resulted in immediate technical problems. It was as if someone was actively monitoring his communications and selectively jamming transmissions that contained sensitive information. By the first week of September, Melvin had documented at least 20 separate instances of organized human activity in the forest surrounding his tower. The figures appeared to be conducting systematic reconnaissance, mapping his daily routines, documenting his communication schedules, and establishing positions that would allow them to monitor or potentially interfere with his operations. Most troubling was their apparent knowledge of fire watch protocols and procedures. The figures positioned themselves to avoid detection during his scheduled observation sweeps, moved in patterns that took advantage of blind spots in his surveillance coverage, and seemed to anticipate his responses to various environmental conditions. This level of tactical awareness suggested either extensive training in counter-surveillance techniques or insider knowledge of fire watch operations. Either possibility indicated a serious security threat that went far beyond simple trespassing or unauthorized camping. Melvin had begun keeping a detailed log of his observations, documenting times, locations, numbers of personnel, and apparent activities. The data showed clear patterns of escalation, with the frequency and boldness of the unauthorized activities increasing steadily over time. Initially, the figures had maintained considerable distance from the tower, remaining at least a mile away and avoiding direct sight lines. But as weeks passed, they began moving closer, sometimes approaching within a few hundred yards of the tower's base during hours when Melvin would normally be conducting interior maintenance or preparing meals. The psychological pressure of constant surveillance had begun affecting Melvin's ability to concentrate on his primary duties. He found himself checking and rechecking his observation areas, spending more time monitoring the forest for human activity than watching for fire risks. Sleep became difficult as he remained alert for signs of movement around the tower during nighttime hours. Most disturbing was his growing suspicion that the figures were somehow coordinating with his radio communications. Several times, he'd observed increased activity immediately after conversations with Agnes, as if the surveillance team was receiving real-time information about his reports and supply schedules. This possibility suggested that either his communications were being intercepted, or Agnes herself was involved in whatever operation was targeting his position. Both scenarios were deeply troubling, implying security breaches that extended beyond his isolated tower to the regional coordination system itself. On September 12th, Melvin had made a decision that he would later recognize as the beginning of his psychological unraveling. Instead of reporting the surveillance activities through the official channels that seemed compromised, he decided to conduct his own counter-surveillance operation, using his elevated position and optical equipment to gather intelligence about whoever was monitoring him. The decision had seemed logical at the time, a reasonable response to an obvious security threat that wasn't being adequately addressed by his supervisors. But it marked the point where Melvin transitioned from being a passive observer to an active participant in what was becoming an increasingly paranoid spiral of suspicion and fear. He'd begun varying his routines randomly, conducting observations at unusual hours, using different radio frequencies for test transmissions, and maintaining detailed notes about correlation between his activities and movements in the forest below. The data he collected seemed to confirm his worst suspicions about coordinated surveillance, but it also began revealing patterns that didn't make rational sense. The figures appeared to be present in multiple locations simultaneously, moving distances that would be impossible for normal humans to cover in the observed time intervals. They seemed to anticipate his counter-surveillance activities with uncanny accuracy, always positioned to avoid his attempts at detailed observation while maintaining their own monitoring capabilities. Most unsettling was their apparent ability to influence his equipment and communications. Radio interference intensified whenever he attempted to photograph or document their activities. Weather instruments provided false readings that seemed designed to distract him from surveillance activities during critical observation periods. By September 15th, Melvin had documented over 50 separate encounters with the unauthorized personnel, but he'd been unable to obtain any clear photographs or definitive evidence of their activities. Every attempt at documentation had been frustrated by equipment failures, lighting problems, or the figure's uncanny ability to avoid detailed observation. The psychological stress of constant surveillance combined with communication isolation had begun creating symptoms that Melvin recognized from his insurance investigation work. Paranoid ideation, hypervigilance, sleep deprivation, and increasing difficulty distinguishing between legitimate security concerns and anxiety-driven misinterpretation of normal forest activities. But the equipment failures and communication problems were objective facts that couldn't be dismissed as psychological symptoms. The tower's structural integrity issues were documented and measurable. The radio interference was consistent and repeatable. These problems existed independently of his mental state, even if they were contributing to his growing paranoia. It was during the evening of September 15th that the situation escalated beyond surveillance into direct confrontation. Melvin had been conducting his routine sunset observation sweep when he'd noticed movement much closer to the tower than any previous encounters. Through his binoculars, he could see at least 12 figures arranged in a wide circle around the tower's base, all of them looking upward at his position. For the first time, he could observe the figures clearly enough to note specific details. They were all wearing identical dark clothing that looked like military or law enforcement tactical gear. They moved with coordinated precision that suggested extensive training and clear command structure. Most disturbing, they all appeared to have similar physical characteristics, as if they'd been selected for specific qualifications or possibly even genetic similarities. "This is Tower 19, Melvin had radioed immediately. "I have immediate security threat, multiple armed personnel surrounding my position. Request immediate backup and law enforcement response." The response had been immediate and clear, but completely wrong. "Copy Tower 19, weather conditions noted. Supply helicopter delayed until Friday due to mechanical problems." "Negative," Melvin had shouted into his radio. "This is not weather, this is security emergency. I have hostile personnel at my location, requesting immediate assistance." But the radio had gone completely dead, not even static, just perfect silence. Melvin had tried backup frequencies, emergency channels, even his personal cell phone, but no communications equipment was functioning. He was completely cut off from outside assistance. From his elevated position, Melvin could see the figures beginning to move closer to the tower's base. They maintained their coordinated formation, but they were definitely approaching with apparent intent to access the structure. Some of them appeared to be carrying equipment that might be climbing gear or possibly tools for cutting through the tower's security barriers. The realization that he was about to be directly confronted by unknown personnel in an isolated location with no means of communication or escape had triggered a panic response that overwhelmed Melvin's previous training and experience. His hands were shaking as he tried to formulate a response plan, but his options were severely limited. The tower had been designed for fire observation, not defense. There were no weapons beyond a small personal firearm that Melvin carried for wildlife protection. The structure itself offered limited defensive positions, with only one access ladder and no backup escape routes. If the figures were determined to reach him, there was very little he could do to prevent it. But as Melvin watched through his binoculars, preparing for what seemed like an inevitable confrontation, something unexpected happened. One of the figures separated from the group and began climbing the tower's access ladder with smooth, practiced movements that suggested extensive familiarity with the structure. As the figure ascended, Melvin could see that it was wearing what appeared to be an official Forest Service uniform, complete with badges and insignia that matched his own. When it reached the observation deck and stepped through the access hatch, Melvin found himself face to face with someone who looked remarkably similar to himself. "Good evening, Melvin," the figure said in a voice that was almost identical to his own. "I'm here to relieve you of duty. Your replacement period has been approved, and all transition procedures are ready to implement." Melvin stared at the figure with growing horror. The facial features were nearly identical to his own, but there were subtle differences that created an uncanny valley effect. The skin was too perfect, too uniformly colored, without the variations and imperfections that marked natural human flesh. The eyes were too focused, too unblinking, lacking the micro-movements and involuntary reactions that indicated normal human consciousness. "Who are you?" Melvin demanded, his voice cracking with strain. "What kind of authorization?" "I haven't received any official notification of replacement procedures." The figure smiled with Melvin's face, but the expression looked rehearsed rather than spontaneous. "Authorization has been processed through appropriate channels. All documentation is in order and ready for your review." It produced a folder containing what appeared to be official Forest Service transfer orders, signed by supervisors Melvin recognized and bearing stamps and seals that looked authentic. But as he examined the paperwork, he noticed subtle inconsistencies that suggested sophisticated forgery rather than genuine documentation. "These documents are fraudulent," Melvin said, handing the folder back. "The signatures are too consistent. The formatting doesn't match current agency standards, and the processing dates don't align with normal administrative procedures." "Are you certain?" the figure asked, tilting its head at an angle that seemed slightly too far for normal human neck flexibility. "How confident are you in your knowledge of current administrative procedures? When did you last review updated documentation standards?" The questions were reasonable, but delivered with mechanical precision that suggested programmed responses rather than spontaneous conversation. As if the figure was working through a decision tree of pre-planned replies rather than engaging in genuine dialogue. More figures were ascending the tower ladder now, their coordinated movements creating rhythmic vibrations that made the entire structure sway noticeably. When they reached the observation deck, they arranged themselves around the small space with the same military precision Melvin had observed from ground level. "We understand this transition may be confusing," they said in unison, their voices creating an unnatural harmony that hurt Melvin's ears. Change is always difficult to process, especially after extended periods of isolation. But we're here to help facilitate a smooth handover of responsibilities. Melvin found himself surrounded by figures that wore his face and spoke with variations of his voice, all of them maintaining uncomfortably direct eye contact while explaining procedures he didn't understand. The psychological pressure was overwhelming, creating disorientation that made rational thought increasingly difficult. "What do you want from me?" he asked, though his voice came out as barely more than a whisper. "Nothing," they replied together. "We want you to rest." Extended isolation duty has created significant stress and fatigue that requires professional attention. We're here to assume your responsibilities while you receive appropriate care and rehabilitation. One of them produced a chair that seemed to unfold from equipment Melvin hadn't noticed, positioning it in the center of the circle they'd formed around him. "Please sit," it said. "Let us handle all operational requirements from this point forward. You've done excellent work, but it's time for others to take over." The chair looked comfortable, and Melvin realized he was indeed exhausted from weeks of hypervigilance and sleep deprivation. His legs felt unsteady, and the psychological pressure of the confrontation was making it difficult to maintain focus on the situation's inherent dangers. But as he considered sitting down, Melvin noticed that the figures were already beginning to operate his equipment with apparent familiarity. They were checking weather instruments, reviewing observation logs, conducting routine maintenance tasks with efficiency that suggested extensive prior knowledge of the tower's systems and procedures. "How do you know the operational procedures?" Melvin asked, remaining standing despite his fatigue. "These protocols aren't in any manual. They're based on experience with this specific equipment in these specific conditions." "We've been studying your methods," one figure replied, while another updated logbooks with handwriting that matched Melvin's own. "Observing your routines, learning your techniques, preparing for seamless transition of responsibilities." The admission confirmed Melvin's worst suspicions about the surveillance activities he'd been documenting. These figures had been watching him for weeks or months, studying his behavior, learning to replicate his duties with perfect accuracy. The surveillance hadn't been random or coincidental. It had been preparation for this moment. "Studying me for how long?" Melvin demanded. "Since the beginning of the season," they replied in unison. "We've been monitoring all operational activities, documenting procedures, analyzing performance metrics. We have complete records of every observation, every communication, every decision made during your tenure." The psychological implications were staggering. Everything Melvin had done during his months of isolation had been observed and recorded by unknown entities who were now using that information to justify replacing him. His privacy, his solitude, his sense of personal security had all been illusions maintained while he was being studied like a laboratory specimen. But the technical implications were even more disturbing. The level of surveillance they described would have required sophisticated equipment and extensive coordination. The figures weren't just random intruders. They represented some kind of organized operation with significant resources and clear objectives. "Who do you work for?" Melvin asked, though he suspected the answer wouldn't provide much clarity. "We work for efficiency," they replied. "For accuracy, for consistency, for the elimination of human error in critical safety operations. Firewatch duties are too important to be compromised by isolation stress, equipment familiarity issues, or personal judgment variations." As they spoke, Melvin could see them implementing changes to his equipment and procedures with mechanical precision. Weather monitoring systems were being recalibrated, communication protocols were being updated, observation schedules were being modified according to parameters that seemed more rigorous than anything the Forest Service had ever required. "You're not Forest Service personnel," Melvin stated, though he wasn't sure what alternative explanation made sense. "We're your replacements," they said simply. We're here to do your job better than you can do it yourself. We don't experience fatigue, don't suffer isolation stress, don't make observational errors based on emotional states or personal preoccupations. The claim was simultaneously arrogant and possibly accurate. Melvin had to admit that his performance had declined during the past month as surveillance stress and communication problems had affected his concentration and judgment. If these figures could maintain constant vigilance without the psychological limitations that affected human observers, they might indeed be more effective at firewatch duties. But the cost of that efficiency would be the complete replacement of human judgment with mechanical precision, the elimination of intuitive decision-making in favor of programmed responses. Firewatch required more than just technical observation. It required understanding of complex environmental interactions and the ability to make rapid decisions based on incomplete information. "What happens to me?" Melvin asked. "You receive appropriate care," they replied. "Treatment for isolation stress, debriefing about operational experiences, rehabilitation for return to normal social environment. You've served well, but human limitations make extended solo duty inadvisable." It sounded reasonable, almost benevolent, but Melvin recognized the implications. He would be removed from his position, probably subjected to psychological evaluation and treatment that would discredit any reports he might make about this encounter. His observations about surveillance and equipment interference would be classified as symptoms of isolation psychosis rather than legitimate security concerns. Meanwhile, these figures would assume control of one of the most important fire observation positions in the region, with access to communication networks and surveillance capabilities that could be used for purposes far beyond forest fire prevention. The implications for regional security were staggering, but no one would believe his warnings about the threat. The realization that he was being manipulated by entities with capabilities and resources far beyond his understanding created a panic response that overrode Melvin's previous attempts at rational analysis. His hands were shaking as he reached for his emergency radio, hoping against logic that some communication channel might still be functional. But before he could activate the radio, one of the figures stepped forward and gently but firmly took the device from his hands. "Communication is no longer necessary," it said in his own voice. "All required notifications have been processed through appropriate channels. Your supervisors have been informed of the successful transition." "That's impossible," Melvin protested. "You've been jamming my communications. No signals have been getting through." "Selective signal management," the figure replied. "We've been filtering your transmissions to prevent confusion or premature disclosure of transition procedures. But all necessary administrative communications have been processed normally." The technical sophistication required for selective communication jamming was far beyond anything Melvin had imagined. These entities possessed electronic warfare capabilities that exceeded military specifications, suggesting backing by organizations with resources that went far beyond simple Forest Service operations. But if they had such advanced capabilities, why were they interested in replacing Firewatch personnel? The position was important for forest fire prevention, but it didn't provide access to sensitive information or critical infrastructure that would justify the expense and complexity of this operation. Unless Firewatch duties were just the beginning. Tower 19 provided surveillance coverage of a vast wilderness area, communication relay capabilities that connected multiple agencies, and command authority over emergency response resources. Control of the Firewatch network could potentially enable monitoring and manipulation of law enforcement, search and rescue, and environmental management operations across the entire region. The scope of the potential security threat was overwhelming, but Melvin had no way to communicate warnings to anyone who could take appropriate action. His isolation, which had been designed to protect him from external distractions, now made him completely vulnerable to threats that his supervisors couldn't even imagine. As these realizations crystallized, Melvin felt his psychological defenses begin to collapse under the weight of absolute helplessness. He was trapped 90 feet above ground with entities that possessed capabilities beyond his understanding, completely cut off from assistance, facing threats that extended far beyond his personal safety to encompass potential compromise of critical public safety infrastructure. The chair they had provided looked increasingly inviting as exhaustion from weeks of stress and hypervigilance finally overwhelmed his ability to maintain alertness. His legs were unsteady, his thinking was becoming confused, and the psychological pressure of the confrontation was making rational decision-making impossible. But as Melvin considered surrendering to the inevitable, something unexpected happened. The sound of helicopter rotors began echoing from somewhere in the distance, growing steadily louder as the aircraft approached his location. The figures around him immediately tensed, their coordinated movements becoming more rapid and agitated as they recognized a development their planning hadn't anticipated. For the first time since the confrontation began, they seemed uncertain, exchanging glances that suggested confusion about how to proceed. "That's not scheduled," one of them said to the others, though they continued speaking in Melvin's voice, creating the surreal effect of listening to himself discuss problems he didn't understand. Through the observation deck windows, Melvin could see lights approaching from the south. Definitely a helicopter, probably Forest Service based on the flight pattern and timing. But how had they known to come? His communications had been blocked for hours, and the figures claimed they'd been filtering his transmissions to prevent outside interference. The helicopter's approach created an opportunity that might not occur again. If Melvin could signal the aircraft and alert them to the situation at the tower, the pilots might be able to call for backup and investigate the security breach. But he would have to act quickly before the figures could implement whatever contingency plans they'd prepared for unexpected complications. With the last of his physical and mental energy, Melvin lunged toward the tower's emergency flare launcher, a device designed to signal distress to aircraft during emergency situations. If he could fire a flare with the appropriate distress code, any Forest Service pilot would recognize the signal and respond according to emergency protocols. But before he could reach the launcher, multiple figures moved to block his path, their coordinated response demonstrating the tactical training and communication capabilities he'd suspected throughout the confrontation. They weren't just replacing him, they were preventing him from interfering with whatever operation they represented. "That's not necessary," they said in unison, their voices carrying a harder edge than previous communications. "All required notifications have been processed. The approaching aircraft is part of normal operational procedures." But Melvin could hear tension in their synchronized responses, suggesting that the helicopter's arrival wasn't part of their planning. They were improvising, adapting to unexpected circumstances, which meant their operation wasn't as precisely controlled as they'd claimed. The helicopter was close enough now that Melvin could hear individual rotor blade beats and see navigation lights through the growing darkness. It was definitely approaching his tower, not just passing through the area, which meant someone had specifically directed the aircraft to investigate his location. The implication was that someone, probably Agnes, had become concerned about his extended communication silence and dispatched emergency response to check on his status. If that was true, then the figure's claims about filtering his communications while maintaining normal administrative contact were false, meaning their technical capabilities weren't as sophisticated as they'd implied. But the helicopter's approach also created immediate danger. If the pilots were expecting routine contact with Melvin and instead encountered the figures who claimed to be his replacements, the situation could escalate rapidly with potentially catastrophic results for everyone involved. Melvin had to find a way to warn the approaching aircraft about the security threat without enabling the figures to prevent outside assistance from arriving. But his options were extremely limited, and the figures were clearly prepared to prevent any action that might compromise their operation. As the helicopter completed its approach and began circling the tower, Melvin realized that whatever happened next would determine not just his own fate, but potentially the security of the entire regional fire watch network. The confrontation in Tower 19 was just the beginning of something much larger and more dangerous than anyone had imagined. The Grand Canyon Visitor Center closed at 8 p.m. sharp. Ranger Phineas had worked the closing shift for 3 years, knew the routine by heart. Make announcements at 7:30 and 7:50, escort lingering tourists out, lock up the exhibits, set the alarms. Simple, predictable, safe. That Thursday in October started like any other closing shift. The last tour bus had left at 6, taking most of the crowd with it. By 7, only a handful of visitors remained, browsing the geological exhibits or watching the sunset through the massive windows that overlooked the south rim. Phineas made his first announcement over the intercom. Attention visitors. The Grand Canyon Visitor Center will be closing in 30 minutes. Please make your final purchases at the gift shop and begin making your way to the exits. Most people started moving toward the doors. A family gathered their children from the interactive displays. An elderly couple folded their maps and headed out. But in the far corner, near the historical timeline exhibit, 2 figures didn't move. Phineas walked over to them. A woman sat on the bench, staring at the old photographs of the canyon's early explorers. She was maybe 40, well-dressed but disheveled, like she'd been traveling for days without rest. Her hands clutched a worn leather purse in her lap. "Ma'am, we're closing soon," Phineas said gently. "I need to ask you to start heading to the exit." She looked up at him with red-rimmed eyes. "I'm waiting for someone." "I'm sorry, but they'll have to meet you outside. The center closes at 8. "No," she said firmly. "She said to wait here. Buy the photographs. She said she'd come." Phineas noticed the security guard, Jedediah, watching from across the room. Jedediah had worked there even longer than Phineas, knew how to handle difficult visitors. Phineas gave him a subtle nod, asking for backup without alarming the woman. "Who are you waiting for?" Phineas asked, sitting down beside her. "My sister." "Cordelia. She works here." Phineas knew every employee at the visitor center. There was no Cordelia. "What department does she work in?" The woman's face crumpled slightly. I don't know. She just said she worked here, said if I ever needed help, to come here and wait by the photographs." Jedediah approached, his heavy footsteps deliberate on the polished floor. "Everything all right here, Ranger Phineas?" "This lady is waiting for her sister. Says she works here." Jedediah studied the woman carefully. "What's your name, ma'am?" She hesitated. "Does it matter?" "It might help us find your sister." "Margaret," she said finally. "Margaret Dawson. My sister's Cordelia Dawson. Or maybe she uses a different name now. It's been 15 years. 15 years. Phineas exchanged a glance with Jedediah. This wasn't about meeting an employee, this was something else. "Ma'am, why don't you come with us to the office?" Phineas suggested. "We can check our employee records, maybe make some calls." Margaret stood reluctantly, clutching her purse. They walked to the administrative area behind the main exhibits. The offices were mostly empty, just a few staff finishing paperwork. Phineas led Margaret to a small conference room while Jedediah made a call to dispatch. "Tell me about your sister," Phineas said, trying to keep her calm. "When did you last see her?" 15 years ago, she was 22. She came here for a summer job working at the canyon. She called once, said she loved it here, said she'd found where she belonged, then nothing. You reported her missing? Of course. Police, Park Service, everyone. They searched for weeks, found nothing. They said she probably fell, got lost, the canyon took her. But I knew better. How? Margaret opened her purse, pulled out a postcard. The image showed the Grand Canyon at sunset, generic tourist fare. But on the back, in faded ink, was a message. Margaret, I'm safe. I can't come home. They won't let me, but I'm alive. If you ever need to run, come to the visitor center. Wait by the photographs. Someone will help you. See, the postmark was from 3 years ago, 12 years after Cordelia had disappeared. Phineas studied the card. The handwriting looked authentic, not rushed or forced. But the message was disturbing. Who were they? Why couldn't she leave? Mrs. Dawson, are you in some kind of trouble? Is that why you're here? She nodded, tears starting to fall. My husband, he hurts me, has for years. I finally left last week, but he's looking for me. I remembered Cordelia's card, thought maybe whoever helped her could help me. Jedediah returned, his face grim. Dispatcher ran the name. Cordelia Dawson was reported missing in 2008. Case went cold, no body ever found. She's not dead, Margaret insisted. That postcard could have been sent by anyone, Jedediah interrupted. Ma'am, if you're in danger from your husband, we can help you. Real help, shelters, protection orders. No, Margaret stood abruptly. You don't understand. Cordelia said to wait here, said someone would come, someone who could make me disappear like she did. Phineas felt a chill run down his spine. Make her disappear, like Cordelia had disappeared. This wasn't about help, this was about something else entirely. Mrs. Dawson, your sister didn't disappear by choice. Something happened to her. Something saved her, Margaret corrected. From her life, from everything. And now, it can save me too. The lights in the conference room flickered. Power issues were common in the old building, but the timing felt ominous. Jedediah's hand moved to his radio. I'm calling for backup, he said. Something's not right here. Before he could key the radio, the door opened. A woman entered, wearing a visitor center uniform that looked authentic but outdated. The style was from years ago, the logo slightly different. She was young, maybe mid-20s with long dark hair and pale skin. Hello, Margaret, she said softly. I've been waiting for you. Margaret gasped. Cordelia? But Phineas could see it wasn't. This woman was too young to be Cordelia, who would be 37 now. Yet there was a resemblance, something in the bone structure, the eyes. I'm not Cordelia, the woman said, but I knew her. She sent me to help you. Where is she? Margaret demanded. Where's my sister? Safe, happy, free, just like you can be. Jedediah stepped forward. Who are you? I don't recognize you, and I know everyone who works here. The woman smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. I work the night shift, different department, facilities. There is no night shift in facilities, Jedediah said flatly. And you need to show me some ID right now. The woman ignored him, focusing on Margaret. Your sister talked about you all the time. Said you were strong but stuck. Said someday you'd need what she found. What did she find? Margaret asked desperately. A way out, a place where the past can't follow, where names don't matter and pain doesn't reach. Phineas moved between them. Ma'am, whoever you are, you need to leave. This woman needs real help, not fairy tales. The woman's expression hardened. You don't understand, Ranger. Some of us can't use your kind of help. Some of us need to disappear completely. Like Cordelia disappeared? Is she really alive? Alive is a relative term. She exists, she continues, she's free from what she was. The lights flickered again, longer this time. In the darkness, Phineas heard movement, footsteps that didn't match where anyone was standing. When the lights came back, there were 2 more people in the room. Both women, both wearing the same outdated uniforms. Both with that same pale complexion, that same distant look in their eyes. They stood by the door, blocking the exit. Jedediah had his hand on his weapon now. Everyone needs to calm down. I don't know what this is, but it's a rescue, one of the new women said. We rescue those who can't be saved any other way. By making them disappear? By faking their deaths? By giving them new lives, new identities, new purposes. Margaret was looking between them all, hope and fear warring on her face. Could I really just vanish? My husband would never find me? Never, the first woman confirmed. You'd be reported missing, presumed dead, another canyon tragedy. Your old life would end completely. That's kidnapping, Phineas said, or fraud, or both. It's freedom, the woman countered. Ask Margaret what her life is worth living. Ask her if the bruises under her makeup are worth preserving her identity. Phineas looked closer at Margaret. Now he could see them, faint but visible. Bruises on her neck, her wrists. Old ones and new ones. A woman who'd been systematically hurt for who knows how long. There are legal ways, he started. That don't work, Margaret interrupted. I've tried. Restraining orders, police reports. He always finds me, always convinces them I'm lying or exaggerating. His family has money, connections. This is my only option. What happened to Cordelia? Jedediah demanded. The truth. The first woman sighed. She came here running from a stalker. Ex-boyfriend who wouldn't accept the breakup. He followed her here, tried to grab her in the parking lot. We intervened. Who's we? Those of us who've escaped. We help others do the same. Give them new identities, new lives far from here. Cordelia chose to stay and help others. She saved dozens of women over the years. Where is she now? Close. But she can't show herself. She's dead, remember? Has been for 15 years. Phineas's mind was racing. An underground network of disappeared women, helping others escape abuse. It sounded insane, but the evidence was standing right in front of him. How many of you are there? Enough. We have people in various departments, different shifts. We watch for women like Margaret. Women who need to disappear completely to survive. This is illegal, Jedediah said. Whatever your intentions... Our intentions are to save lives, the woman interrupted. How many women die each year from domestic violence? How many could be saved if they could simply vanish? There has to be another way. For some, maybe. But for women like Margaret, like Cordelia, this is the only way. Margaret stepped forward. I want to go with them. Mrs. Dawson, please think about this, Phineas urged. Your family, your friends, will mourn me and move on. Better that than finding me dead in my kitchen one day when he finally goes too far. The lights went out completely. Emergency lighting kicked in, casting everything in a red glow. In the dim light, Phineas saw more figures. Women of various ages, all in those outdated uniforms, all with that same distant look. They filled the room, surrounded them. How is this possible? Jedediah whispered. The canyon has many secrets, the first woman said. Hidden places, forgotten spaces, we use them all. You're telling me there's an entire community of supposedly dead women living in the Grand Canyon. Not in the way you're thinking. We come and go. We have lives elsewhere, new identities, new purposes. But we return when needed, when someone like Margaret needs us. Margaret was crying now. Please, I can't go back. I won't survive going back. The first woman held out her hand. Then don't. Come with us. Leave Margaret behind, become someone new. This is insane, Jedediah said. I'm calling this in. He reached for his radio, but it was dead. No static, no power, nothing. His phone, too. Phineas checked his own devices. All dead. EMP, one of the women said. Localized, temporary. By the time your devices work again, we'll be gone. You can't just take her. We're not taking anyone. Margaret is choosing to come. After you've manipulated her, preyed on her desperation, after we've offered her the only real escape from a man who will eventually kill her. Margaret looked at Phineas. You seem like a good man, Ranger, but you don't understand what it's like. The fear, the constant vigilance, the knowledge that one day he'll go too far. These women are offering me life. They're offering you exile. Isolation, a fake existence. Better than no existence at all. She took the first woman's hand. Immediately, the other women closed around them, forming a protective circle. They began moving toward the door. Jedediah and Phineas surrounded but unable to stop them. Please, Phineas tried one more time. Let us help you the right way. Margaret paused, looked back. There is no right way for someone like me. There's only survival or death. I choose survival, even if it means becoming someone else. They moved through the visitor center, the emergency lights flickering as they passed. Phineas and Jedediah followed, helpless to intervene. The women moved like they knew every corner, every blind spot, every hidden passage. At the loading dock, a van waited. No plates, no identifying marks. Margaret climbed in without hesitation. The first woman turned to Phineas and Jedediah. You'll report her missing. Say she was distraught, ran into the canyon. You searched, but found nothing. Another tourist tragedy. We won't lie. Then tell the truth. Say a group of women took her. See how that goes over, see if anyone believes you. She was right. Who would believe this? Dead women returning to rescue abuse victims? An underground railroad of disappeared people? Cordelia, Phineas said suddenly. Let me talk to Cordelia. The woman smiled sadly. She's here. She's been here the whole time. One of the other women stepped forward, removed a wig. Underneath, her hair was shorter, grayer. Her face was older, marked by years of hard living. But the resemblance to Margaret was unmistakable. Hello, Ranger, Cordelia said softly. Thank you for being kind to my sister. You've been here for 15 years? Not here exactly, but nearby, helping women like Margaret, like I was helped. Your family thought you were dead. I was dead, the person I was, the life I lived. That stalker would have killed me. Instead, I was reborn, given purpose, saving others, giving them the same choice I was given. Disappear or die. Not everyone takes it. But for those who do, we're here. How many? Over the years? Hundreds, maybe thousands. We're everywhere, Ranger. The invisible women, the ones who chose vanishing over victimhood. The van engine started. Margaret was inside, barely visible through the tinted windows. Cordelia moved toward it. Wait, Phineas said. Your parents. They're still alive. They never stopped hoping. Cordelia paused. Tell them. Tell them their daughter loved them. But she had to choose life, even if it meant losing them. She climbed into the van. The first woman was the last to enter. Before she did, she handed Phineas a card. Business card, blank except for a phone number. If you ever encounter a woman who needs us, really needs us, call this number. We'll know if you're sincere. I can't be part of this. You already are. You let us leave. You'll file the report. You'll perpetuate the lie because you know, deep down, that we're saving lives your system can't. The van drove away, disappearing into the darkness beyond the loading dock. Phineas and Jedediah stood there, their devices suddenly working again. Dispatch was calling, asking for status updates. Jedediah answered, said everything was fine, just a power issue. Phineas said nothing, stared at the card in his hand. They went back inside, found the visitor center exactly as it should be. No sign of the women, no evidence of what had happened. Even the security cameras showed nothing, just static during the crucial moments. "What do we do?" Jedediah asked. "What can we do?" "Report that a woman who was being abused chose to disappear with a group of other disappeared women? That her supposedly dead sister is actually alive and running some underground railroad?" So we lie. We report what we can prove. A distressed woman came in, talked about her missing sister, then left. We don't know where she went. It wasn't technically a lie. They didn't know where Margaret went, not specifically. Somewhere she could become someone else, start over, escape the man who hurt her. They filed their reports, bare minimum details. Margaret Dawson was reported missing by her husband 2 days later. Search teams found nothing. Another tourist who'd wandered into the canyon and never came out. Phineas kept the card. He'd see women sometimes in the visitor center who had that look. That desperate, haunted look of someone trapped with no escape. He'd watch them, wonder if he should make the call. He never did. But sometimes those women would disappear anyway. Reported missing, never found. He'd wonder if the network had found them, offered them the choice: vanish or suffer, disappear or die. 3 months after Margaret disappeared, Phineas received a postcard. Generic Grand Canyon sunset. On the back, in neat handwriting, "Thank you for letting me choose. I'm free now. Different name, different life, but free. M." He kept it in his desk drawer next to the business card. Evidence of something he couldn't fully understand or accept, but couldn't deny either. The Grand Canyon swallowed people all the time. Usually it was tragedy, but sometimes maybe it was rescue. Jedediah transferred to another park 6 months later. Said he couldn't handle the ambiguity, the questions. Phineas stayed. Someone had to. Someone who knew the secret, who could look the other way when necessary. He started noticing things. Employees who didn't quite fit, whose records were too clean. Visitors who lingered by the historical photographs, waiting. Vans with tinted windows in the parking lot at odd hours. The network was real, active, saving women in the only way they could. By erasing them, giving them new lives, new identities. It was illegal, immoral by conventional standards. But for women facing death, it was salvation. A year later, another incident. A young woman, barely 20, bruises on her arms, fear in her eyes. She stood by the photographs as the center was closing, waiting. Phineas approached her. "Can I help you?" She looked at him with tears in her eyes. "I was told to wait here, that someone would come. He could call security, follow procedure, or he could walk away, let the network do what it did. Save her or doom her, he didn't know which. The center's closing," he said gently, "but take your time. Sometimes, if you wait long enough, help arrives." He walked away, didn't look back. An hour later, when he checked, she was gone. Vanished, like Margaret, like Cordelia, like hundreds of others. The next day, she was reported missing. Boyfriend distraught, claimed she'd been depressed. Search teams found nothing. Another canyon tragedy, another unsolved disappearance. But Phineas knew better. Somewhere, she was alive with a new name, a new life, a new chance. The network had saved her, as it had saved so many others. He thought about reporting it many times. The ethical weight of his silence was heavy. But then he'd remember Margaret's bruises, her desperation, her relief when offered escape. He'd remember Cordelia, choosing to spend 15 years helping others rather than reclaiming her old life. Who was he to judge? Who was he to deny desperate women their only escape? The business card stayed in his drawer, unused but not discarded. A reminder of the choice he'd made, the secret he kept. The Grand Canyon had many mysteries, but this one was different. This one was human, purposeful, necessary. 5 years passed. Phineas became senior ranger, responsible for visitor center operations. He hired carefully, watching for signs of the network. They were good at hiding, but he'd learned their patterns. Sometimes late at night he'd see lights in closed sections of the building. Movement where no one should be. He never investigated, never reported it. The network needed safe spaces, and he could provide that much. One evening, closing up alone, he found someone waiting in his office. The first woman, the one who'd taken Margaret. She looked exactly the same, as if 5 years hadn't passed. "Hello, Ranger Phineas. What do you want?" "To thank you. For your silence, your understanding. You've saved lives by looking away. I've enabled kidnapping. You've enabled rescue. And there's a difference. Is there? These women disappear forever. Their families suffer. Their families suffer less than finding them murdered. And the women survive. Isn't that worth something?" He didn't answer. The moral calculus was too complex, too painful. "We're expanding," she continued. "Other parks, other places. The network grows because the need grows. Violence against women doesn't stop, so neither do we. Why tell me? Because we need allies, people in positions like yours who understand, who can help without actively participating. You've been that for us. We wanted you to know it matters." She left an envelope on his desk and walked out. Inside were photographs. Women he'd seen disappear over the years, but different. New hairstyles, new clothes, new names written on the back. Alive, safe, free. Margaret was among them. She looked healthier, happier. Her new name was Sarah, lived in Canada, worked as a teacher. The woman who'd been someone else entirely. At the bottom of the stack was a note. "Every one of these women would be dead without us. Without you. Remember that when doubt creeps in." Phineas burned the photos, couldn't risk them being found. But the images stayed in his mind. Proof that the disappeared weren't dead, just transformed. The canyon hadn't swallowed them, it had birthed new versions of them. He retired early, the weight of the secret finally too much. Moved to a small town in Colorado, far from any canyon. But the knowledge followed him. The network was out there, growing, saving women in the only way that worked for some. His replacement at the visitor center was a woman named Patricia. Clean record, impeccable references. But something in her eyes was familiar. That distant look, that sense of carrying secrets. She called him once, months after he'd left. "The photographs are still popular," she said. Lots of visitors stopped to look at them. Code. Women were still coming, still being saved. The network continued. "That's good," he replied. "History should be preserved." Yes, and sometimes history repeats itself in the best possible way. More code. The cycle continued. Desperate women arrived, disappeared, were reborn elsewhere. The Grand Canyon kept their secret, as it kept so many others. Phineas never knew how many women the network saved. Hundreds? Thousands? Each one reported missing, presumed dead, but actually living new lives far from their abusers. It was the greatest magic trick he'd ever seen, making people disappear completely, leaving no trace, no trail to follow. The canyon was the perfect cover, its vastness and danger explaining any disappearance. He kept the business card until the day he died, never used it, but never threw it away. A reminder of the night he'd learned that sometimes disappearing was the only way to survive. That sometimes the kindest thing you could do was look away and let someone vanish. The Grand Canyon Visitor Center still closes at 8 p.m. sharp. Rangers still make announcements, escort tourists out, lock up the exhibits. And sometimes, just sometimes, a woman waits by the historical photographs, desperate and afraid. If she waits long enough, if she truly needs it, help arrives. Not the official kind, not the legal kind, but the kind that saves lives by erasing them. The network endures, hidden but vital, offering the ultimate escape to those who need it most. The canyon keeps their secret, as it always has. Swallows their old selves and births new ones. Transformation through disappearance. It's been happening for decades, will continue for decades more. Because as long as women need to vanish to survive, the network will be there. In visitor centers and parks, in hidden spaces and forgotten places. Saving lives by ending them, creating freedom through erasure. The ultimate rescue, disguised as tragedy. The canyon's greatest secret, hidden in plain sight.